On a cold morning in the early 1990s, long after the last East German border guard had locked away his rifle, a different kind of front line opened up in Berlin. Not at Checkpoint Charlie, not along a minefield, but inside a reading room full of cardboard boxes, dusty folders, and humming computers. Men and women in sweaters sat at long tables, lifting out files stamped with the emblem of a vanished state, the German Democratic Republic. Between their fingers were the handwritten reports of border troops, Stasi officers, judges, and party officials. Millions of pages documenting, in numbing bureaucratic detail, what it had cost to keep a country inside its own fences. One of those researchers was a man named Klaus Schroeder. He had not built tunnels or flown balloons. He had not faced searchlights or mines. He came from the West, from Everswinkel in Westphalia, and his weapon was something very different, a spreadsheet. But what he was about to assemble would change the way the world understood the Berlin Wall and the border that cut Germany in half. Klaus had grown up in a country that called itself the Federal Republic of Germany, anchored in NATO and tied tightly to the United States. As a boy in the 1950s and 60s, he heard radio reports about crises in Berlin, about Soviet tanks and American tanks facing each other on Friedrichstrasse, about a wall of concrete and barbed wire. He listened as American presidents spoke about freedom in Berlin, and he watched as the Muse showed a line on the map that, somehow, could not be crossed without risking your life. By the time the wall fell in 1989, he was no longer a boy. He was a political scientist, trained in statistics and comparative systems, teaching and researching at the Freie Universität Berlin. When the archives of the East finally opened, Klaus was exactly the kind of person you would send into that maze of paper, someone who knew that if you counted carefully enough, the numbers themselves would tell a story. In 1992, he became head of a new research group at the Free University, the Forschungsverbund SED Stadt, the Research Association for the SED State. Their mission was simple to describe and incredibly hard to execute, to reconstruct from the inside out how the East German dictatorship had actually worked, not just its speeches and ceremonies, but its prisons, its informants, its border guards, and its dead. The Stasi had believed that by watching everything, by writing everything down, it could control the future. Now, those same notes were being fed into Western computers, turned into data sets, cross-checked against West German police files, refugee records, and court transcripts. Day after day, Klaus and his colleagues asked the same questions over and over of different boxes and different pages. How many tried to escape? How many made it? How many died? How many were punished for the simple act of helping someone else reach the West? For Americans watching this from afar, it's tempting to see the Cold War only in terms of missile counts, tank divisions, and GDP curves. But what Schroeder began to assemble was a different kind of scoreboard, a ledger of human movement and human cost. To understand his numbers, you have to go back to the beginning. After 1945, Germany was split by the victors of World War II. In the West, the Federal Republic, supported by the United States, Britain, and France, rebuilt on the foundation of Marshall Plan money, free markets, and integration with the wider Western world. In the East, the Soviet-backed German Democratic Republic took shape, a one-party state run by the Socialist Unity Party, the SED, with a centrally planned economy and a security service, the Stasi, woven into every neighborhood. On the map, the line between those two Germanys was just that, a line. On the ground, it evolved into one of the most technologically dense border systems on the planet. Double fences, signal wires, trip-triggered guns, minefields, watchtowers, dog runs, patrol roads, radar, and floodlights. And then, in the middle of it all, like a challenge thrown down in concrete, came the Berlin Wall in August 1961. For the leaders in East Berlin and Moscow, all of this hardware was necessary, Before the wall, millions had already left the east by slipping through Berlin's still open sectors and flying out through West German airports. Engineers, doctors, students, skilled workers, they walked across a city street and boarded a literal jet age into the American-led world. If you grew up in East Berlin or Leipzig in the 1950s and 60s, you might have built radios from scavenged parts, tuned in to Western stations powered by transmitters in West Germany and beyond. You could hear American music, Western advertisements, news from a world where cars were bigger, shops were fuller, and universities were open to anyone who could pass the exams. The response of the East German state, with Soviet backing, was not to make life so good that people stopped wanting to leave. It was to criminalize leaving. The act itself got a name: Republik Flucht, fleeing the Republic. And once something had a word in the penal code, it had a file in the archives. When Klaus and his team began sifting through court records and Stasi documents, a picture emerged. Between the late 1950s and the end of the 1980s, over 75,000 people were convicted in East German courts for trying to escape or for related border offenses. Tens of thousands more were investigated, interrogated, demoted, or expelled from their jobs for contacts with the West or suspected help to fugitives. That's where the 50,000 punished figure you sometimes hear comes from, a shorthand for the massive group of people whose lives were bent or broken, not because they spied for Washington, but because they tried to visit a cousin in Munich or help a stranger cross a field in the night. Then there were the ones who got away. By combining East German, West German, and Allied statistics, Schroeder and others concluded that over the 4 decades of the GDR's existence, roughly 3.5 to 4 million people left the East for the West in one way or another. That number includes those who moved before the wall went up, those who received exit permits under pressure, and those whose freedom was literally bought by West Germany in prisoner exchange deals. But even if you pare it down to the years after the wall, when the wall and the inner border were fully operational, you are still looking at tens of thousands of people who managed to cross illegally past dogs, mines, and automatic guns. In interviews, Klaus often boiled that down for lay audiences, about 40,000 successful escapes over or through the fortified border itself after the wall. 40,000 individuals and families who voted with their feet, in the most literal way possible. For an American audience accustomed to hearing about the missile gap and the space race, these escape statistics offer a different kind of race between a system trying to lock people in and a world they were willing to risk everything to reach. Some of the numbers that fascinate people the most are the ones about tunnels. Digging under the wall became part of Cold War folklore, stories retold in books, movies, and museum exhibits. You can picture the scenes: damp basements in West Berlin, students and engineers holing out buckets of dirt, ex-miners shoring up passages with scavenged timber, all the while listening for the thump of East German boots overhead. The reality, as the Schroeder generation of researchers documented, is as dramatic as the legend and more sobering. Between 1961 and 1989, at least 70 to 75 tunnel projects were started in and around Berlin. Some began in West Berlin bakeries, some in garden sheds, some even from the eastern side. Of all those projects, only 19 were completed and used successfully.
Those 19 tunnels allowed roughly 300 to 400 people to escape to the west, an astonishing achievement on a human scale, but tiny compared to the 40,000 total who got out across all routes. To catch the others, the East German security apparatus turned to its own technology. Seismographs were buried near suspected digging sites, microphones were planted in basements. The Stasi infiltrated tunneling groups with informants, feeding coordinates to border troops who would then flood or collapse the passages just before they were ready. When you walk through a tunnel exhibit today, you see wooden beams and rusted rails and imagine courageous young people crawling through the dark. In Klaus Schroeder's files, you see case numbers and casualty tables. One tunnel, Tunnel 57, named for the 57 people who used it, is followed in the records by a list of arrests, interrogations, and one dead border guard, Egon Schultz, another story in its own right. But tunnels were only one chapter. In other files, you find photos of modified cars and trucks, compartments welded into fuel tanks, false floors with just enough space for a human body to lie flat, hidden between the axles and the asphalt. You find maps of sewer systems and canal networks used in the first frantic years after 1961, before those routes too were sealed and monitored. Schroeder's work helped put these fragmentary stories into context. For every sensational method of escape that made the news, balloons, microlights, hijacked ferries, there were hundreds of ordinary crossings on foot, by car, by forged papers. Each successful case meant someone had found a way through a system that on paper looked and felt impregnable. Of course, not everyone made it. When the Berlin Wall Memorial lists the dead, it gives names and dates. Behind those names lies another set of numbers, painstakingly pulled together by commissions and research groups, including projects Klaus's association collaborated on. More than 100 people died at or near the Berlin Wall itself, shot, blown apart by mines, drowned in the Spree, or killed in desperate leaps from buildings that suddenly became the front line. Along the wider inner German border, the toll was even higher, hundreds killed over the decades by bullets, explosives, and accidents linked to escape attempts. And then there was the sea. For years, the Baltic coast of East Germany looked on brochures like a harmless vacation strip, beaches, waves, families building sandcastles. In reality, it was another border zone. Recent research by the University of Greifswald and partners, in which the SED State Research Group took part, documented at least 135 confirmed deaths and a total of 212 cases linked to escape attempts across the Baltic Sea and via other Eastern Bloc borders between 1961 and 1989. Boats overturned, swimmers vanished, bodies washed ashore miles from where they had stepped into the water. Klaus's job was not to retell every one of those tragedies. It was to make sure they could not be waved away as isolated incidents. Imagine him at his desk in the early 2000s, a stack of printed tables on one side, a CRT monitor on the other, the soft clatter of a German keyboard filling cells in a database. He inputs year, location, method of escape, outcome, legal charge. He cross-references court verdicts from Magdeburg, border troop reports from Thuringia, West German refugee logs in Hanover. The result is not a single dramatic headline, but an architecture of evidence. Instead of, people said the GDR was repressive, you get 70,000+ convictions for escape-related offenses, roughly 40,000 successful illegal border crossings after the wall. Around 70 tunnels started, 19 used, perhaps 400 people freed that way. Hundreds dead on land and sea, 12-year-olds and 70-year-olds alike. In American terms, it's like the difference between a war movie and the Pentagon's casualty stats. One shows you individual heroism or horror, the other shows you scale. Klaus never disguised what he thought these numbers meant. Over and over in essays and interviews, he used a particular word for the GDR, Unrechtsstaat, a state of injustice, a system in which the law itself was bent around the needs of the ruling party, in which leaving your own country could be punished like a serious crime, and in which helping someone cross a river could be treated as treason. He was often blunt, especially when confronted with a certain kind of East German nostalgia, what Germans call Ostalgie, fond memories of cheap vacations, guaranteed jobs, and subsidized childcare, told as if the wall was just a minor inconvenience. Yes, he would say, people built lives inside that system, but the fact that tens of thousands tried to escape and tens of thousands more were punished for trying or helping is not an anecdote, it is a verdict.
For Americans, listening to him lay this out, there's a familiar rhythm. During the Cold War, the United States argued that its model was superior, not just because it could build better weapons, but because people wanted to live under it. When you see, in black and white, that thousands risked mines and bullets to get into the western half of Germany, those speeches sound less like rhetoric and more like a description of what actually happened. And yet, there's another layer here: technology. When you walk along the preserved sections of the inner German border today, you see relics of the GDR's border tech: searchlights with Soviet bulbs, tripwire-triggered guns, concrete tank obstacles, electric fences carrying lethal current. You can almost hear the beeping of sensors in the night, the crackle of radios as border units responded to a detection. In the same museums, you see what people used to beat that system: forged passports printed on stolen paper, modified Volkswagens with hidden compartments, handmade inflatable boats, perhaps even a panel about those famous hot air balloons stitched from dress fabric in secret living rooms. From one angle, it looks like a clash between a high-tech state and resourceful amateurs. From another, it's a reminder that the most advanced surveillance grid in the Eastern Bloc still depended on human beings to enforce it, men whose hands shook on triggers, whose reports ended up in files that decades later would be scanned into Western databases. This is where Klaus Schroeder's story loops back to the larger Cold War arc that American audiences know so well. On one side of the Iron Curtain, you had the United States and its allies pushing the limits of what machines could do, landing spacecraft on the moon, wiring together early networks that would become the Internet, building color TV satellites that beamed images of that very wall into homes around the world. On the other side, you had a bloc that could launch rockets and lead in specific military technologies, but which used much of its innovation to perfect internal control: bigger border fences, more sensitive microphones, thicker files on its own citizens. In the end, when those Eastern archives were opened, it was Western tools, PCs, database software, color TV satellites that beamed images of that very wall into homes around the world. On the other side, you had a bloc that could launch rockets and lead in specific military technologies, but which used much of its innovation to perfect internal control: bigger border fences, more sensitive microphones, thicker files on its own citizens. In the end, when those Eastern archives were opened, it was Western tools, PCs, database software, color TV satellites that beamed images of that very wall into homes around the world. On the other side, you had a bloc that could launch rockets and lead in specific military technologies, but which used much of its innovation to perfect internal control: bigger border fences, more sensitive microphones, thicker files on its own citizens. In the end, when those Eastern archives were opened, it was Western tools, PCs, database software, color TV satellites that beamed images of that very wall into homes around the world. Klaus Schroeder did not end the Cold War. He did something that comes after wars. He counted. He took a regime that had wrapped itself in slogans about anti-fascist protection walls and socialist legality and showed with data what those words had actually meant in practice. They meant 75,000 convictions for trying to leave. They meant maybe 40,000 successful illegal escapes across a border that was supposed to be airtight.
They meant roughly 70 tunnels started in desperation, 19 of them successfully used. They meant hundreds of dead along a line that Western maps colored in red and which Eastern maps tried to show as just another frontier. For the Soviet leadership, for the SED, for the men in gray suits who signed off on those border orders, the revelation of these numbers was a kind of posthumous shock. They had built what they thought was a technically sophisticated, ideologically justified system, but when their own paperwork was fed through Western machines and minds, it revealed something stark, that no amount of concrete or code words could change the fact that tens of thousands of people had chosen to leave their world for another. For Americans, the story of Klaus Schroeder is not just a story about Germany. It's a reminder of what was at stake in the Cold War, of why presidents talked about Berlin, why radios beamed rock music and news across borders, why engineers poured their lives into satellites and broadcasting networks as well as missiles. Because in the end, the contest was never only about who could destroy the other side. It was about who could attract, who could inspire, who could make people risk everything to cross a line on a map. And if you want to know who really won that contest, you don't just have to watch old speeches or war movies. You can look at Klaus Schroeder's tables, the ones filled quietly in a reunited Berlin with rows of names and routes and outcomes. In those rows is a story that speaks louder than any slogan, that when faced with a choice between a state that imprisoned those who tried to leave and a world that welcomed them, tens of thousands of East Germans chose to step, dig, swim, fly, and crawl toward the side backed by the United States. The wall is gone, the minefields are silent, the watchtowers are rusting away, but in the numbers that Klaus Schroeder pulled from the ruins of a collapsed system, the verdict of history is still there, clear enough for anyone on either side of the old divide to read.